Hey there, Vernacular Faithful. Redcode here. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about gaming price point. As an independent developer, one of the hardest things that one person can do is actually properly evaluate their game and put it out there such that people would actually buy it. So I was thinking about this, and one of the things about the game for many, many moons, it had a very flat price point for when new things came out. Generally speaking, you pay $50. Now, granted, it says $49.99 on the tin, but of course, that is a little bit of corporate trickery where you basically say, well, no, it's not actually $50, it's $49. And there's a thing about when you're changing the tens, a love where you're changing the tens, where it makes you think more like it's a $40 thing, when in actuality it's a $50 thing. But I digress. In any case, $50 for your average title. Now, assuming that they were properly evaluated at that time, assuming that, one could derive a value per hours of time spent. Now, the average game at that time, I would say, gave you roughly 40 hours worth of engaging experience. And if you were a gamer, you'd usually derive about 3 times that, I'd say, because you'd probably replay the game a couple times and you'd also full complete it. So we're looking at this from with the normie, forgive the phrasing, but the average person, Joe Blow, who's just like, I just wanna play this for a little while, have some fun. Game ends, I'm done with it. We'll move on to the next thing. So I would say for that person, it's gonna be roughly 40 hours worth of play before they either get bored with it or they finish it. So with that in mind, that gives us a value where we divide the 40 into the 50, and that'll give us dollars per hour. And of course, I should mention I am operating in dollars, and yes, I know the dollar is on fire, but perchance to dream that it was actually stable currency, and we're also looking at this from the angle of the time when that $50 price was actually salient. So, perchance to dream. The route, we get $1.25 per hour of play. So, per hour of, let's define that as hour of engaging play. So, that gives us a interesting little valuation point right there, where if let's say your game gives about 20 hours worth of play, which in reality I think that would be where you categorize a lot of more arcadey things that are more in the vein of, say, Contra or Metal Slug, um, even Mega Man to an extent. These are things that are meant to be, you play through it and you finish it, and if you're really into it, then you play through it again and you kind of perfect it. I'd say it's roughly maybe 3 playthroughs, and the game is quite possibly like 8 hours or something like that. So you kind of get a little bit more than you paid for on a 20-hour title. But 20-hour title. If we're going by the $1.25, let's calculate it real quick. So $20 title, and if you're going at that $1.25 rate, puts you about $25 worth of value. Now, with that said, when we're looking at those types of titles, and I intuited that, I'd roughly price them at about $20. Now, that intuition, I think, does come from a little bit of that corporate thing, where the $49.99 made me think of the price actually at 40, and then me thinking of, well, half the hours, half the price of the 40, that puts it at 20. But in reality, we're actually halving it at half the 25. So it rolls out that 20-hour game, pay about $25 for it. Now, there's some other elements that we need to be thinking about here, because now, and I think this is a part of where we're going to get some things. Well, I guess before we get there, because I was going to talk a little bit about the idea of graphical quality and whether or not that actually should factor into the price point. I'm going to get there, but first, let's talk about the $70 game. So $70 game, right? So knowing that, we have the amount of hours put in there, and we get about a $25 price point. And I would say that that feels about right. I mean, that's about the price that you're going to expect for, old school Game Boy games to go at. Now, yes, I know they've inflated to about 30 to 35. And one could argue that because they're now pricing, now we're playing basically SNES and N64 games on those consoles, on those little handheld consoles, it follows that that price probably has expanded, rightfully so. But that's another question. But for that $70 game, let's see what the calculus bears out, shall we? So let's divide 70 bucks by $1.25. What do we get? So 56 hours of play. Now, my intuition suggested that a $70 game should probably provide about 60 hours worth of play. And if we round up on the tens, that would put us there. I mean, we're at 56, and so that's to a rounding error. That would get us up to 60 hours worth of play. Now, the next question is, those $70 games that are being sold right now, do they actually provide 60 hours of actually engaging content? It's a good question. Now, one of the things you have to wrap your mind around is what is considered actually engaging and what is actually considered the user making up for the lack of engagement. So it's a bit tricky, because are you paying for the playground that allows you to make your own fun? Or are you paying for the guided experience that gives you a series of estimable events, fun things to play through? It's a little bit harder, I think, to actually evaluate the sandbox games for this reason, because as a designer, one of the things that you will do is that you will actually time a level. You will actually time it minute by minute and figure out, at this point they should be doing this, therefore we're going to push them in this way. At this point they should have done this many things, therefore they're overstimulated, we need to let them rest. If at this point they've gone through this many things, X, Y, Z. There's a whole thing with regard to that. And putting aside some questions with regards to whether or not we should even be pacing players when they go through things, especially when you consider that usually if a player wants to take a rest, they'll put the controller down and push the pause button. Barring that argument and all of this stuff that's in there, we have another question with the sandbox games, which is, if we provide the player with the tools to entertain themselves, does that count as something that we should be paid for? Because, I mean, it's kind of like, giving a player, a Lego set. Even when you give them Legos, you still give them a map that tells them how to put the pieces together. And certainly, people will pay for individual Lego pieces, right? And when they get a thing, they pay for the design itself, so that they can make their own little Millennium Falcon, or they can make their own little glacier base. I love those glacier bases, by the way. They're fun. That was a kid. Anyway, but if you buy the individual bricks, you don't pay for making your own form of Gondor, right? Like you bought the bricks and you put them together, you make your own Gondor. Like the bricks aren't on lease to you. You're not renting the bricks. That would be a different model. But with this idea of buying a sandbox environment, the question is, unless there's some already scripted events that are going to be in there that you can, as a designer, calculate out down to the minute the experience the player's gonna be able to have if they're playing the game at a relatively competent level. Obviously, you can basically multiply by 3. You can multiply or divide by 3, I think, in either direction based on player skill. But with that in mind, I would hazard that I'm not certain if these $70 games are actually providing 60 hours worth of truly engaging play. Now, not all of them, but it's a real question. It's a real question, and I mean, again, we have to come back to the idea of truly engaging and whether or not the player is making the fun for themselves. I'm not going to get into actually defining what engagement is, because that's a whole video on its own. But I think it's important to really think about that with any particular game. So for instance, say Assassin's Creed. So you're paying for a sandbox, right? Right. So you are paying for the sandbox and the skeleton, the framework, which allows you to encounter enemies, assassinate them, kill them, find various items in the world, and avoid detection. So already we have a framework. Okay, cool. So there's another game that kind of follows that same framework, and that is the Metal Gear Solid series, right? Now, difference, it's not a sandbox until we get to Metal Gear Solid 5. But over the course of those games, one of the big things that makes it work is the varying arrangements of these encounters, where each encounter has some puzzle that you have to solve to get there, and due to the amount of detail work that the designers have put into the game, each one is its own unique engagement, its own unique couple of minutes to hour of play. So with that in mind, when we look at these sandbox games, such as Assassin's Creed, can one look at any individual engagement that you have in it and realistically say that it is a unique puzzle to solve? Or is it really just the same puzzle that you've solved before with a different veneer in a different location in the same sandbox? If it meets that definition of actually being a puzzle that has to be solved differently, and when I say solved differently, you need to take a different subset of actions, and there is some element that you have to change about the way you interact with the game, non-trivially, mind you, that is different about this interaction as opposed to the other. And I feel like this kind of gets to the heart of the idea of sameness and copy pasta. This is one of the things that devalues a sandbox style game. So consider this to, say, Breath of the Wild. So I will grant you that there is an element of copy pasta across it, because certainly the framework of the sandbox is find same framework of certain elements of the sandbox. For instance, finding the shrines, defeat the challenge in the shrine, get the thing. Granted, the challenges in the shrines are usually pretty unique enough that they do provide a unique puzzle. So we kind of meet the bar there. Additionally, the what is the core goal of the game is to get to Calamity Ganon and then beat the ever loving tar out of him. Now, the you could just go straight there, but I would hazard that that's going to create a large amount of engagement for the player just in the fact that they only have 3 hearts and they're going to have to figure out exactly how to solve that. That is one of those. There's a lot of plays that come out of that just by figuring it out. It's the Dark Souls, you will die mentality. By that same token, there's the normal route, which is get the gear, figure out how you're gonna deal with it, and then do it. And they've given you 4 different dungeons to deal with, each one providing a certain amount of hours, and each one providing a certain amount of hours of play, and then you have to deal with the dungeon in the center, the Ganondorf dungeon, of course. And not to mention, we also have a lot of different other things that you can do to improve your ability to deal with those dungeons, which is the shrines, which is the Koroks. There's also finding the Master Sword itself, which you could consider to be another dungeon. So technically, if we're really looking at it, you've got about six major dungeons in there. And so we've got about 6 major dungeons in there, and remember, each dungeon is comprised not just of being in the dungeon, but also the approach. So if we take those 6 dungeons and we split it in half, and I'd say it's roughly about 4 hours per, right? 4 hours per half. 4 hours of approach, 4 hours of dealing with the dungeon. And then you multiply or divide that based on skill. And so that would put you at... What is that? That's 8 times 6, which puts you at a number, and my math is failing me. 56. 54. 54 hours of play right there. And if you remember, the calculation we made for a $70 game was 56. We're 2 hours off. And that's not including any of the extra little baubles and things that you can do in the game. And also excluding the final fight. But I mean, you could count that as a part of the dungeon. Usually, if we really want to give it a little bit of extra there, usually your larger dungeon is, double the size of any of the others, so we could probably double the approach and the dungeon itself, making it 16, which means we add another 8 on top of that, which actually puts it at 62, I think. 54? Yeah, 54 plus 8, yeah, 62. Which means you're actually getting a nice deal. It actually feels good. And I would hazard that the average person who's bought Breath of the Wild has actually been pretty satisfied with the game, based on how people lauded it and loved it and wanted a sequel. I have not had as much experience really looking into Tears of the Kingdom, but I do think applying a similar methodology can tell you whether or not it was similarly worth the value. Certainly, people on the internet are really arguing about that. That is not something that I am going to weigh in on until I have more experience with that game. Either case, Assassin's Creed, Breath of the Wild, we see a little bit of a difference there. Now, I will say, Assassin's Creed at least tries to kind of apes a little bit of that. We've got the different events that you're going to go through and deal with. But at the end of the day, the problem is that there's just a little bit too much sameness between the things. Like the whole idea of gaining new gear, getting new abilities that you can do cool and crazy stuff with in the Legend of Zelda formula helps aid with keeping that engagement fresh, unique, and different from place to place. So, with that in mind, at least in my opinion, I think players are rightfully a little bit miffed at game prices, at the idea of an Assassin's Creed or a Call of Duty being $70 when I feel realistically it's probably closer to a 20 to 40 hour affair as far as meaningful engagement with those games is concerned. But that's just my thinking. More of my intuition kind of firing off there. So when you're looking at your own games, your independent titles, I think kind of looking at it in timing out your plays, getting a sense of how long it takes you to get from point A to point B in any particular thing, and also looking at the variance across it, asking yourself how commonly do you have to change your thinking, how commonly do you have to change your strategy, and how often do you repeat a particular form of thinking or strategy across the span of the game. And I think that'll help you kind of think a little bit about what your price point is. I mean, the other part of it is also just look at the format, look at the era that it's emulating. If it's emulating the N64 era, it's probably going to be a 35 to 34 value game, maybe a 40. Um, I would think. And if it's actually achieving, when I say actually, I mean really, truly achieving that 60 to beyond 60 plus value mark, because I think you would need to actually be 60 plus value mark, that's when you look at it as maybe a 70. And I mean, really, really think hard before you set that price, because a lot of the players that are in the space now. I mean, granted, there's going to be the normals who are just going to they'll just buy it because they have the money for it. But I mean, they're either going to buy it or they're going to be like, that's too expensive, and just not buy games at all. They'll go fishing, or go for a jog or something. Um, but the thing of it is that you really need to think hard if you're going to put something at $70. I mean, it was held at that $50 amount in part because the populace accepted it. And I mean, granted, we trained them in a sense to accept that, but it's still a thing. And I mean, if you're putting something out that's more of an arcadey title, but still has a large amount of content in there to where you could reasonably say that to get through this whole game, it's going to take you about 20 hours um, at average skill level, mind you, then I'd say, yeah, probably price your arcade title at about that $20 mark. But um, again, you really need to be thinking about how many hours you're actually providing to the user. If your thing is more of um, how would I put it, a distraction title, something where in reality, if you're really thinking about it, you could stretch it out to about 6 hours of play. Well, the rate of $1.25 per thing, I mean, that puts us at, well, I'm just going to do the calculation and not do it in my head because that's easier, and I am a spoiled brat. Yeah, be about 750. My intuition had said about 8, but rounding error puts you up to $8 for about a 6 hours worth of experience. And I mean, one of the other things is thinking about a something like that. right? It's 8 hours of 8 hours to 8 to 6. Excuse me, 6 hours of experience for about $8 worth of play. Um, that I know it doesn't feel like what you sold is worth that much because you've probably put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into it. Although I know the amount of blood, sweat, and tears it takes to make a 6 hour experience now is way less than what it was back in the 90s or back in the 80s, even. So, grain of salt there. But that would be my take. Is at least as a starting point for the value that you're giving your game, thinking about it from $1.25 per hour of play. And again, this is assuming, of course, that the American dollar. This was assuming working off of when the American dollar was the base value of cost, which everything else was, all other currencies were rated. That's rapidly changing. I don't, whether you believe me or not, that is happening. So whatever becomes the base currency from whatever does come into play as the base currency, and who knows, maybe the American dollar will come out on top after all. I don't know. Thinking about it from that, $1.25 per hour, I feel like that's a good base number. So, do I want to talk about free to play and DLCs? Yes, but that's going to be another video based off of what I've done here. So, I guess keep your eyes open for that. Anyway, that's all I have to say today on price point. I've had to think about it a lot, and I've put some random numbers to it, and a lot of this is based off of intuition and also making some assumptions. But one of the parts of actually figuring stuff out is that you do end up having to make assumptions and then step in and check and see how valid those assumptions are, and then recalculate. So I invite you to explore in that way. If you are mathematically minded and consider if you've released a game, what did you price it at? And are you giving a discount? Is it worth exactly what you sold it for? Or are you raking the user over the coals for something that is not worth that much? Food for thought. Anyway, this has been Redcoat of Vernacular Games. We're currently in a state of flux right now, a lot of stuff going on. Working on a couple micro games, working on a few mid-level games, and a few board games as well. I am currently in the process of getting prototype cards for a particular game printed. Let's see if I can't get that going. As you can tell, a lot of stuff going on. A lot less in my background. There's a reason for that. I might talk about it later. But for now, that's where we're at. So, not as much to report right now, but I will say thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. You can get on the email list for Record Biz, which is one of the things that we helped out a dude with in the listing below. And we've got a bunch of other links underneath to different places where we've either got podcasts or we've got songs posted, or you've just got my smiling face talking to you ad infinitum. So, if you are interested in any of those things, please follow the link, go where you need to go. And if not, well, I am happy that you've lasted this long, and I don't know why you're still watching. Alright, ta-ta, toodles, goodbye, adios, play the games you want to play, boyos. This is Redcap, signing off.